Saleem everyone. My name is Farhana Esmail, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or a historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. We would like to open our session today by acknowledging that the land on which I reside is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Wichita and Caddo affiliated tribes in the Dallas area. These tribes have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we would like to pay our respects to elders both past and present. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. So our session today will be a book talk about the recently published book called Women and Gender in the Qur'an with Dr. Celene Ibrahim. During today's book talk, we will explore some examples of women in the Qur'an and learn more about how the status of women has shifted over time, thus reinforcing structures and roles. During this session, you will see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. So with that, let me introduce to all of you the esteemed author of the book, Women and Gender in the Qur'an, Dr. Celene Ibrahim. Dr. Celene Ibrahim is the author of Women and Gender in the Qur'an from Oxford University Press, as well as Islam and Monotheism from Cambridge University Press, which will be forthcoming in 2022. She has also authored dozens of academic articles. She is the editor of One Nation Indivisible, Seeking Liberty and Justice from the Pulpit to the Streets from Whip and Stock Publishers. Dr. Ibrahim is a faculty member in the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy at Groton School. She has written extensively on themes related to women and gender in Muslim intellectual history and is a public voice on issues of religious pluralism. Dr. Ibrahim holds a doctorate in Arabic and Islamic civilizations and a master's degree in women's and gender studies and Near Eastern and Judaic studies from Brandeis University, as well as a master's of divinity from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree with the highest honors from Princeton University. At the outset of this conversation, we would like to note that the views of our speaker expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. So let's turn now to our conversation. Welcome, Dr. Ibrahim. As we begin, we wanted to share our honor in having you join us today and say thank you again for taking the time to be here and to speak with the Ismaili community about your book. So maybe we can start by having you share with us what motivated you to do this research and write this book.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah, wa ala ahlihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, I'm so pleased to join you today. And I should say also that I'm coming to you from the original land of the Nashua people in southern New Hampshire. So I'm very pleased to be on this call today because I know a number of people are very much invested in the theme of women and Islam broadly. And I think women in the Qur'an is actually the basis for understanding women in Islam, given that the Qur'an is our sacred book shared across Muslims of all backgrounds. And so when I first conceived of this project, I had been familiar with the history of tafsir, the history of Quranic exegesis, And yet I struggled to find maybe myself as a woman, as a contemporary woman, reflected in the writings of this genre. It seemed very much that although the writings were astute, theologically speaking, on some of the contemporary issues that would relate to me as a Muslim woman living in the US in the 21st century, I found that there was actually somewhat of, I wanted more. Let's just say that I wanted more from the tafsir tradition. And so when I set out to, in fact, write my first book, I wanted to write a book that could contribute to an academic literature on the Qur'an coming out of the secular academic sphere. But even more than that, I wanted to write a book that could speak to other, and I say primarily women, because that's where I was feeling the biggest draw, but really Muslims of all different backgrounds who might also have some of the same questions that I did when I came to this project. And some of those questions included, what is the inherent worth of a woman in the Qur'an, a woman as compared to a man? What are the roles that are outlined in terms of a woman's presence in the family, in society? And even, I think the most driving question for me was, in the estimation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did women have a different status than men do? And so those were some of the big questions that I brought to the project. And I honed in, rather than honing in on Islamic law, which is what some female scholars of the Qur'an have focused on, I wanted to really look at the stories, because the Qur'an gives us, in its stories, it gives us ethical lessons, moral lessons. And I felt that stories with regard to women were somewhat underutilized in what I was seeing in terms of Muslim contemporary public preaching and the like. I was very familiar with themes of prophets, for instance, among the male figures in sacred history. But I knew that there was more to the Qur'an in terms of the presence and the stories of women. So that was the impetus, the original impetus for the book.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And maybe we can define some terms first for everybody that's here. So you've spent a lot of time studying the Quran, and you mentioned terms such as exegesis / tafsir. So maybe you can define for us what that means.
So tafsir is essentially a very old genre of the Quran. In terms of extant tafsirs that we have, we do have some from the first, second century of the Islamic era, and there's multiple ways in which to go about a tafsir. So some scholars have gone through line by line and compiled commentary on the verses. Some mufassir, some people who engage in tafsir writing, will collect multiple opinions on a given verse and then narrow it down to give the meaning that they see the verse most coherently having. Other tafsirs take more of a thematic approach. And so we have tafsirs that come, for instance, out of the Sufi tradition that are most focused on what are the verses that speak to the purification of the nafs, the soul, for instance. There's also then tafsirs that are more legally minded, looking at the verses of the Quran that have a direct bearing on law, on jurisprudence, on fiqh. And so when I set about doing a tafsir, I thought about more of a thematic angle. And so my approach was to do a tafsir based on all of the verses that related in some way to women figures. And for that, I counted more than 300 verses. So this is, in a sense, the Quran has over 6,000 verses, and I was only looking at a subset of those verses. But I think that I think that there could be many more volumes on just those 300 verses. I don't think I exhausted it, but my aim was to do something more comprehensive. Other scholars in the past had done deep analyses of specific figures, and I found that very valuable to draw upon, but I really wanted to do a comprehensive approach that allowed me to put different figures who are in the Quran in comparison to each other. So we have women who are paragons of virtue and women who are damned to hell. And how do we understand womanhood when we have such a large spectrum, for instance, of women represented? So that was really my way into tafsir. And I should say that historically speaking, the mufassir, the people who are experts in tafsir, would have had an extremely high degree of fluency across different Islamic sciences. So for instance, we have tafsir that are written by people who are hadith specialists and the like. And so what I brought to the Quran was as a specialist in women and gender studies, which of course is not a specialization that existed in the medieval period, for instance.
Thank you so much. So these mufassirs that you mentioned, who would be counted as a mufassir? And historically speaking, have women been part of this tradition, or have women not been as involved in the study of the Quran?
That's a great question. And so women have always studied the Quran since the very beginning. But what we do find is that women scholars, when we find them, many of them tended to be hadith specialists. And that genre in particular was an area in which women contributed greatly in Islamic history. There's a contemporary book called Al-Muhaddithat, meaning the women hadith transmitters, and by Muhammad Arkan Nadwi, who is a UK-based scholar and has multiple volumes. It's, I think, several dozen at this point volumes on the history of women scholars. There's also been some influence of women in the field of Islamic law. That was a very early influence, and it tended to fade somewhat. In the contemporary period, once again, we see some women who are able to once again hold roles in Islamic law, some of them serving as judges, but very, very few. And the area of tafsir, so tafsir is we can think of it as a written genre primarily. And the sad thing that is that when we come to women's scholarship on the Quran, we have to wait until the modern period until we have women who are publishing works, publishing books, that we could go to the shelf and pick up their writings. Now, this is not to diminish the roles that women play in transmitting the Quran, in teaching it, in forming their own relationship with the Quran in the context of their own spirituality. But if we look at a bookshelf, we're going to find a tremendous dearth of women's scholarship on the Quran relative to that of men's.
And can you talk about why that is? Because it seems like women are involved in the early period, perhaps during the time of the Prophet, and then they're involved in contemporary times, but there's this huge gap of almost like 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. So there's various reasons for this, that we see the gap in women's intellectual production really in the form of books across societies, not just in Islamic societies. And even to the present, it's just, even in the present age, we're still struggling to have women represented on university faculty and the like in Europe and the Americas. So this is not a Muslim issue specifically. I think what we have to realize is that Islam in its early days and under the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ elevated women's roles in intellectual production. And we have to also recognize that women participated in rituals, religious rituals, which maybe doesn't sound shocking to us as modern peoples, but if we think about other societies around the world, women are studying and transmitting Islamic sacred knowledge in a time in which that was not a common practice for women. And I think if we look to the Quran and we say, why is this the case that women were not writing commentaries? We can't find a reason from within the Quran. So it is entirely a social phenomena.
That's so interesting, because a lot of times these concepts are linked to religious narratives and as ways of demonstrating piety. Could you talk about how this power and privilege situation within Quranic studies. So how it has impacted obviously women participating in scholarship, but can you also talk about how it has impacted women's stories in general and how those have been told or explored or studied?
It's a great question to ask, and we have to actually approach it. There's like a hypothetical question here. So what would our bookshelf of Quranic studies look like if women had in fact been publishing tafsir since the 7th century Common Era, the 1st century of the Islamic era? What would our knowledge base look like? Would it look different than what we have today? And that's a hypothetical question, but I really think it is. I really think people of different backgrounds, different life experiences bring different insights to the process of interpretation and understanding. And so I wonder now that we are seeing more voices, more women scholars working on the Qur'an, and in Europe, in the Americas, in different places in the world, coming out of an intellectual tradition that is both academic and is also informed by Muslim sacred sciences. So it remains to be seen what will women's voices add to this genre. When I think about my own work and what I wanted to add, I felt in some ways there were certain figures who had been not treated in their full complexity. For instance, one of those figures, and we can get maybe more into this, is the wife of the vizier of Egypt who adopts Joseph, and who then proceeds to tempt him. And if we look at how she has historically been treated, her example rises to the forefront as emblematic of all women, and all women are temptresses. And in fact, if we look at the women that the Qur'an mentions, which I counted to be several dozen, she's one of many other women, and she's in fact the only temptress figure. So to take her example and to lift it up and say, this is characteristic of all women, or this is the nature of all women, well, in fact, we have many other women who did not act as temptresses. And I also wanted to ask the difficult question, which is to say, in the Quranic example, we have one story that is akin to what we would call sexual harassment or sexual assault. And I really wanted to ask the question of the Qur'an, which is, in our lived lives as women, as people in the world, we observe that most frequently women are in fact the targets of sexual assault or unwanted sexual attention. And so I asked, one of my questions in approaching this story was, why? Why does the Qur'an, if the example in the world is more commonly a male towards a woman directing unwanted attention, why is this story the opposite way around in terms of gender? And one of the answers that I came to, and this might resonate with people who have come from a difficult experience either of sexual harassment or sexual assault, is that to read a story like this, if it was in fact sexual violence directed towards a female body, that could be re-traumatizing in a way that hearing the story when the genders are reversed is perhaps not as traumatizing. So for instance, in my classroom, if I'm going to talk about a story related to sexual assault, I will always give a warning. And many times I will have someone from the class say, I would rather not attend this lecture because I'm recovering. This is something that impacts me directly. And so I started to wonder that of the Qur'an, if this is something, the Qur'an pervades our society, pervades our consciousness. And so this is just one example of an insight that perhaps coming from an experience as I do of working as a female chaplain and working with women and understanding the tremendous impact that sexual harassment, sexual violence has played in so many women's lives, it gives me an angle into understanding this story much more than simply projecting a stereotype of women as temptresses onto women at large.
I really resonate with that. And I appreciate this idea that the Quran is kind of like looking out for us in a way without us even realizing it. I wanted to ask, so the lack of women's publications in terms of tafsir and Quranic commentary, do you think that has impacted the way that women and girls are studied in the Quran? And then in turn, does that impact the roles and structures that women have in society itself? So like, does the lack of participation in scholarship then translate to some type of consequence in social circles?
Yeah, and I think if we take the example of the wife of the vizier again, commonly known as Zuleika, if we take her example, she's been used as a way to relegate women from the public sphere, because if you let these temptress women into the public sphere, they're going to create havoc. And so that's one example of how a detrimental, a stereotype really of women at large has then impacted what on the ground women in society are able to do. And rather, I think if we start to unpack some of the harmful stereotypes of women by taking that back to the Quran and putting forth other examples. So for instance, the Queen of Sheba is really a figure in the Quran that shows us the nature of diplomacy in avoiding war. It shows us the nature of a woman sovereign who has a tremendous ability, a tremendous poise, and not only a political knowledge and a political acumen, but actually a spiritual acumen as well. So in this way, we could lift up another aspect of women in the Quran by just shifting the gaze to another figure that is in the text, but is not often represented in terms of, and this is an exemplary woman ruler, for instance. So those are the kind of subtle shifts that I'm trying to make in the work. The Queen of Sheba, in fact, if we look at women's speech in the Quran, as she's contemporary, or as she's conventionally known as Bilqis, she has a very prominent voice in the Quran. And so if we start to think about what is the example that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us of using our voice, well, here we have this woman ruler. So she can be an exemplar for women who want to go into the political sphere, want to go into the diplomatic sphere, and et cetera. And there's many other examples of this. She's also the only woman in the Quran who is not either the wife of somebody or the mother of somebody. So she is, in kind of what we would call in contemporary times, an independent woman.
Yeah, so you've mentioned two women so far. You've mentioned the wife of the vizier, Zuleika, and you've mentioned the Queen of Sheba. Can you talk more about, who are other women and girls who are depicted in the Quran? How are they depicted? Like, what are the different types of women that the Quran actually talks about?
So Miriam, alayhi salam, peace be upon her, is both a figure who, in her own right, she has this beautiful connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we're ever thinking in a contemporary sense about the worth of a girl child, here we have Maryam, who has this connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which she receives provisions in her private chamber directly from God. And so she's an example of kind of the power, the potential of a girl child in her spirituality. And there's a tendency, maybe because the Quran talks about Mary as someone who's chosen among all of the women of the world, to kind of put her out to the side and not use her so much as an exemplar, because her piety seems to be of such an unreachable, unattainable degree for everyday women. And I think on the one hand, yes, we can recognize how the Quran is lifting her figure up in a very specific way. On the other hand, there's some inherent beauty and thinking about her as an exemplar for girl children, and for, you know, just that inherent piety, that inherent love of praying, that the way in which Maryam is able to speak with angels. She speaks with angels. You know, most of her speech in the Qur'an is in fact speaking with angels. And so we've tended to relegate, in the way that Islamic discourses have worked, we've kind of celebrated maybe male piety, and then there's Miriam, and then she kind of gets to be the only one who is celebrated for her piety. But even if we look at a figure like Sarah, the wife of Abraham, may peace be upon that family, she's also hearing the messages from angels. In the Hebrew Bible, we also find extensive passages on Hajar. We don't find Hajar so much spoken about in the Qur'an itself. And to the extent that some people have read my book and said, why did you omit passages on Hajar? And I had to say, well, actually, they're not in the Qur'an. Abraham does pray for his progeny in the Qur'an, but we don't see stories of Hajar. But all this to say that there's a way in which women figures can be motivational for women and girls, but they're also meant to be models for Muslims more broadly as well. So Maryam, in her, you know, the way in which she withdraws and has this very ardent prayer life is an example for all Muslims. The ways in which she's asked to do something that is very, you know, socially difficult. It's an example. We can think about this. We can use this inspiration as maybe contemporary Muslims when we have to assert, you know, no, we don't drink, or no, we don't eat pork, or no, you know, we can look to the example of Maryam and say, you know, here she is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking her to do something for which she knows she's going to receive like a social blowback for, and yet she's faithful and she does it and she takes those steps. So I wanted to also interpret these figures in a way that made them immediate and accessible for us as contemporary people.
Thank you so much. I also know that there are, in addition to some of the figures that we know well in history, there are a lot of anonymous women perhaps mentioned in the Quran. Could you talk more about some of those stories as well?
I'm sorry, I just saw a question in the chat there before we go to that question. If you could re-ask that question in a second. There's a question in the chat that I think bears addressing now. Is there a spiritual positive meaning given to Zuleika's seduction or intense love in the mystical tradition? There certainly is, although I shy away from using that interpretation because I don't ever want it to seem like an oppressor just because they have an immense desire gets a pass on their actions. I think we have to say, yes, she committed sexual harassment, what we could even call sexual assault, and that is wrong. And it doesn't matter, in fact, how intense her love for Joseph was, or how beautiful he was, or how she was enabled by all of the women around her. Me as a contemporary woman who has had to, you know, counsel numerous other women through this, I personally step back from romanticizing that intense love. And maybe that's another example where maybe I, as a woman exegete, approach the text in a very specific way, because I can see that a certain interpretation of the story could actually lead to harm. So I don't want to interpret it as that, oh, girls will be girls kind of interpretation. And I don't want to, I don't want to give her an out. She absolutely, did something that was wrong. And, fortunately, by the end of the story, she was able to admit her wrong. And, someone who was falsely accused was then, exonerated. But that took years. And so I think in this case, Yusuf, in terms of his patient persistence that I am innocent, I'm falsely, accused of this, I think his staying true to himself and what I call kind of being an advocate for himself is actually an exemplary role for a survivor, that survivors could actually look to Yusuf, to Joseph as an example. And as I talk about in the book, just going into this story for another minute, we have to realize that power dynamics in a society are very complicated. And simply because Joseph is a man, actually, he's really a foster boy. He's a Hebrew in an Egyptian household, so he's socially disenfranchised because of his ethnicity. And so their power dynamics in society are complicated. And I think this is a Quranic story that points us in that direction.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. I think this question might be coming from also a standpoint of, from what I have heard in our Ismaili Nikah ceremony, I know that Yusuf and Zuleika are actually mentioned as exemplars. And so there are, I think, different interpretations that people have come across for this story. So thank you for giving that perspective on it. That was really helpful. So yeah, I wanted to shift back to some of the earlier questions about other women who are mentioned in the Quran. You mentioned Mary, you mentioned Bilqis, you mentioned Sarah, but maybe you can talk about other women that you have come across in Quranic stories, and not even just in stories, but maybe some that are mentioned anonymously or randomly.
Wonderful. One of the things I did in the book was trace, according to the scholarly tradition, what are the first verses in the Quran that were revealed, and then all the way through. And of course, there's some differences of opinion there, but there's some broad agreement among scholars. And it turns out that the very first woman figure that's mentioned in the Ark of Revelation is a Meccan woman who, I'll just refer to her as the wife of Abu Lahab. And Abu Lahab, as we know, was an opponent of the Prophet, was a very vocal, despite being a family member, was a very vocal opponent and actually mocked the Prophet. And so the Quran responds with when I teach the story, I call it a roast. And so the Quran essentially, in this beautiful prose, but very biting, condemns not only Abu Lahab, but also his wife, who was an enabler, who also mocked the Prophet. And the couple are said to have been extremely arrogant. And here we have the very first example of a woman in the Quran is another negative example of a woman who, along with her husband, is arrogant, doesn't recognize truth when it comes. They have a familial relationship with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they don't make use of that proximity. And it's really a warning. And in the context of the early surahs, most of them are talking about general themes, are talking about cosmic, the events of the hour and the like. But here we have this very tangible story that is about human morality, and in fact involves this couple that enable each other and get condemned to hell. We find 2 other women in the Quran that are condemned to hell. So in total, we have 3 of several dozen that are in fact mentioned in the context of stories, either at some point in the revelatory arc. The ones who come, the 2 who are also damned, happen to be wives of prophets. So this is Nuh, the wife of Noah, and Lut, they're the wife of Lut. And these 2 women, we don't hear about too much exactly what their personalities were like in the Quran itself, but we do know that they were treacherous onto their husbands who were prophets. Now, if we're just looking at these examples, we have an example of a husband and wife couple who are both enabling each other in the wrong. And then we have these 2 examples of Nuh and Lut, who are prophets, but their wives are betraying them. One of the messages that I think we as contemporary people can take away is that even if we have, pious parents, for instance, or a pious spouse or something, we are responsible for our own, morality, for our own piety in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we can't simply rely on the piety of kind of our relatives as in hope, as a false hope that will in fact cover over our wrongdoings. And the exact opposite is true. If we have pious people in our lives, people who are that just have this beautiful connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and can be sources of guidance, we have to really look inside and check our own arrogance and check our own kind of willful disobedience and make use of the people who are in our lives. And so I think that these figures we don't know so much about them as wives per se, but we can understand this dynamic between spouses and say, regardless of gender, you might be a man, a contemporary man with a very pious wife, and you fail to take advantage of, studying with her or learning from her beautiful character. So there's that story. And there's many other women who are in fact exemplars of piety, including some of the women of the Ahlul Bayt who are given mention in the Qur'an.
Can you talk more about the women of the Ahlul Bayt who are mentioned in the Quran?
Yeah, so the place where the most references come are actually in Surah Al-Ahzab. There's an interesting parallel because in verses in Surah Al-Imran, which is the third surah of the Quran, we find that this surah talks a lot about the households of Ahl Imran, who is in fact let's call him the father of Maryam alayhi salam. And if we think, we never see Ahl Imran in the Quran, but we see this matriarchal lineage from the mother of Maryam, who births Maryam and dedicates her as a child, in the womb to God's service. And so her example is one of tremendous piety. And then we see Maryam. And so Surah 3, right, has this matriarchal heritage of very spiritual women. And then we see that when we come to the family of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right, he has daughters, and he trains his daughters, may Allah be pleased with the family, become tremendous examples for the women, and then in the women of the Muslim community, and then also his wives. And so in Surah Al-Ahzab, which is Surah 33, we also see that the Ahlul Bayt are lifted up as an example of a household that has been purified. So there's a linkage that we can see from the Ahlul Bayt as a purified prophetic family to other families, other prophetic families. So we tend maybe in an Islamic discourse to focus just on the patriarchs and miss the ways in which it's actually, the families oftentimes, and this is true of the family of Ibrahim as well, right? It's not just that his sons are pious, but he actually has two pious wives that perpetuate the tradition and have beautiful relationships on their own terms to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think one of the ways to understand the Prophet's family, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is actually continuing in a tradition of prophetic families that have had women figures who are incredibly close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in this way, they stand in contrast to the families of Nuh and the family of Lut, whose at least the matriarchs of those families don't carry the spiritual tradition within them. The Quran gives us the example of Zainab bin Jahsh in the 37th ayah of Surah Ahzab. So Quran 33:37, chapter 33, verse 37. And here's an example of a woman who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala marries to the Prophet and kind of arranges the entire affair from the heavens. So we see not just that the Prophet's direct family in terms of his daughters is mentioned there in terms of women figures, but we also find that Zainab bin Jahsh, who is a blood relative, a cousin, but who is also then becomes a very esteemed wife and is an example of like generosity of spirit among the early Muslim community. We also find that there's a reference in Surah An-Nur, which is a chapter that deals, in fact, we have Surah An-Nisa that deals a lot with legal rules around women, and that's Surah 4. But then we also have Surah An-Nur, which is 24, that has a number of verses that also pertain to women's social roles. And in that chapter, there's a few verses that refer to the affair of the lie, which is in fact Aisha radiallahu anha, may God be pleased with her, being accused of fornication when she is innocent, and the Qur'an in fact clears her of all of those charges. So in that way, Aisha radiallahu anha is not named, but we can know that the story refers to her in a similar way that Maryam alayhi salam is accused here. You know, she has a baby, she doesn't have a husband. So we have two women in the Quran under different circumstances and different eras, different prophetic families that are both accused of being unchaste, and that who the Quran says, in fact, no, the people have brought a slander.
Thank you so much. And could you also speak a little bit about the Prophet's first wife, Bibi Khadija, and his daughter Fatima? Because I think their stories are particularly prominent in our community, and I'm sure people would love to hear, if they're mentioned or where they're mentioned or how.
Yes, so there's one place in the Quran that if we would look and say, we have to know the backstory to know that this is maybe the subtle presence of Khadija radiallahu anha. There's in the very back of the Quran, in some of the early surahs to be revealed, there's a reference to the Prophet being the one like wrapped up, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses him in these terms, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And we know that there's a beautiful story about when he first receives the revelation and is not sure precisely what is happening to him because of the intensity of the experience. We know that it is Khadija radiallahu anha, that may God be pleased with her, who comforts the Prophet and gives him the inner kind of rest that in fact this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not bring anything negative upon him, because he has an esteemed character, and because he has all these good intentions and performs all of these good deeds, even before the call to prophecy. So we don't see, other than this subtle verse referring to him being enveloped, to being wrapped up in blankets, which according to the commentary tradition, is said to have done when he first received revelation. There's not another way that I found in particular to link her to the actual ayah that we have in the Quran. This is fascinating in a way, because we also know that Fatima radiallahu anha played a tremendous role, like her mother, in comforting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was suffering because of the abuses of the people and because of the frustration that he sallallahu alaihi wasallam was having, vis-a-vis his own family, that she was a tremendous presence in his life. Here's two women, and to this I'll add Hajar as well, who I already mentioned, who are in fact not mentioned heavily in the Quran, but we can understand their roles through other Islamic sources. So the Quran has not given us their specific stories, but fortunately we have much information from other sources.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to shift a little bit from specific women mentioned to conceptually how women are depicted in the Quran. So some questions that I'm thinking about are, how are women depicted in relation to men? Are they less interesting? Are they inferior? Are they equal? We know that biologically that there are differences between men and women, but other than reproductive capabilities, does the Quran describe men and women in different ways, or like what are the relationships between the sexes?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. I think it's one in which we have to emphasize over and over, is that there's not a specific set of characteristics that make a good woman and that a different set that make a good man in the Quranic understanding. In fact, many times when the Quran is talking about morality of women, it has an exact echo, an exact parallel talking about morality of men. So there is, despite maybe sometimes feeling like there might be a double standard in communities on the ground, in fact, I don't find, after scouring the Quran for many years, I don't find that the Quran has a double standard in terms of thinking about women's piety and men's piety. It's very much, there is one standard of spiritual excellence that applies to human beings generally. It's not differentiated in this way. We also don't find verses that say something like, women cook, clean, and take care of the children while men go earn a living. No, we actually find quite the opposite. We find that both women and men are jointly responsible in different ways for the upbringing of the young people. We find that explicit verses that say to a woman what she earns, to a man what he earns. And so there's a parity that I think we haven't fully ingested or imbibed as just general Muslims, in the world today or in Islamic history. In fact, as I look back on it and see the ways in which women's social roles have been at certain points of Islamic history kind of confined a little bit in ways that don't seem quite authentic to the spirit of the Quran, at least. There's when it comes to the womb as an kind of as a sign of God's tremendous, miraculous, the creative force that has been given to the bodies of females, we find that it's not just female humans, in fact, but that the Quran oftentimes talks about the wombs in other species as well. And so the womb is, as much as it is something that women have per se, the womb is actually, the symbolism of the womb is much greater than simply humankind. It is it's a sign of God. And if we're thinking about the signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in the material world for to draw us closer, I mean, it's incredible to like be physiologically a woman with a womb. Like that is like a sign of God that is celebrated in the Quran, but it's also celebrated in a way that is constantly calling men to also respect the womb as this place of, we could maybe even refer to it as like the divine power, right? That comes, that brings life. And no matter how technologically advanced we are, or we like to think we are in our contemporary age, we still can't bring about life, right? We're trying, and many labs around the world are trying to kind of crack this puzzle, but that's part of Allah's power that demands respect.
Thank you so much. I really loved the point that you made about women and men being equal in terms of spirituality and in terms of piousness. And I guess I'm wondering if that message is present in the Quran, then where is the mistranslation within society? Because if you look around the world, you don't necessarily see women being treated as spiritually equal in many communities.
Yes, I mean, I struggle with that question as well. Like, why is this why is something that seems so obvious, maybe to me as I'm drawing it from the Qur'an itself, why do we find really misogynistic ideas in society that somehow, female children should not be educated to the same degree in religious sciences as their brothers, or that, women shouldn't pursue kind of paths of religious scholarship. And this, human beings throughout history, we've always created different hierarchies. And I think gender is one of the ways, along with ethnicity, that we've found ways to exploit one another, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, makes this very explicit in saying that there is no, superiority of a male or a female, or, one tribe or nation over another. And that Quranic verse, to me, it seems like we as contemporary people are kind of just coming to this in our, in our civil rights movement in the West, or in our, our women's rights movement. And it feels like that essential basic principle, linking sort of gender-based hierarchies and ethnic-based hierarchies as two harmful, problematic elements of kind of an unjust society. That the Qur'an has a verse that makes that explicit, coming out of a context that is 1400 years removed from where we are today. It's very, very poignant. And I think we need to reflect on why do we have this tendency to subjugate one another? And is there a different version of relationships that we can imagine and that we can build?
Thank you so much. And I guess maybe my final question before we move on to some audience Q&A is, in all of your work, what is your hope for the future of studying women and gender in the Quran, both for yourself, but maybe also for the field in general, and also for non-academics as well, because I think this type of scholarship maybe can bring faith in the Quran alive for normal believers as well.
Yes, I like to say that a lot of my burning questions that I brought to the Quran related to being a woman, being a wife, being a mother, being a daughter, and trying to figure out what were my roles. And those are the questions that I brought to the Quran, in the form of a research project, but also just as a way to keep like a connection, to keep driving in my own studies of the Quran, to keep working on the Arabic proficiencies. And I would encourage everyone listening today to figure out what are their driving, burning questions. So someone might be a biologist, and the verses that talk about diversity of species in the Quran, or like the biological processes, or maybe even these beautiful descriptions of the womb, like that could be a driving focus that keeps people connected. Maybe people are in the sphere of law or in diplomacy and want to study the Quran from that angle. And the more there's the simple words, and then there's what happens when you contemplate the words, which is you realize that there are many, many layers of meaning. And so inshallah, we need, as contemporary Muslims, we need to keep this connection to the Quran alive. This is the firm handhold, right? This is the living, really, way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give us insights as individual human beings through our striving to connect to this book, to this beautiful discourse.
Thank you so much. And can you speak a little bit about how you see like the future of the field of Quranic studies in academia?
Yes, I'm heartened by the ways in which, let me say this, Quranic studies used to be dominated by people who were not necessarily interested in the spiritual meanings of the Quran. And now we find that the field has expanded to include both people who are just curious about philology, the development of words, but also there's many books now that are looking at the theme of justice and how the Quran conceives of the theme of justice. And in the realm of women's studies, I think we have we can't go too much further in women's studies in the Quran before we develop a really robust men's studies of the Quran. So there's a tendency to imagine women as kind of a permutation of like a normative male. And so until we unsettle that a little bit and actually look really closely into what does masculinity look like from an Islamic perspective, I think that in fact will actually shed more light on women in the Quran.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think we actually do have some audience questions as well that kind of relate to maybe some of these topics that we've been talking about. So I'd like to go through maybe a few of the questions from the audience, and perhaps they can build on this conversation. So one is, you talked a lot about this idea of the Quran perpetuating notions of equality between men and women, but how do we reconcile verses that seem to explicitly share ideas of men being dominant over women, if we feel like the ethos of the Quran is equality?
Yeah, many times if we're just reading the Quran through an English translation, there will be words interpolated into the interpretation of the Quran that are not actually in there in Arabic. And I'll give you an example of this. So 434 talks about differences between men and women, and it actually uses a phrase, we have preferred some over others. And the language is very unspecific. And a lot of times you'll find it just says we have preferred some over others, right? And a lot of times you'll find that interpreters of the Quran or translators have made it say something like we have preferred men over women. And so I think about just people who are not able to access the Quran directly in Arabic to understand that this is an interpolation, and this isn't a commentary that isn't actually maybe true to the spirit of the original language. So if we think of what does preference mean? Well, I, as a woman, I was able to, alhamdulillah, have a child to actually experience, bringing another human being in my body, like into the world, mashallah. And so maybe that's a way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has preferenced females. And, maybe men can on par jump slightly higher or run slightly faster, or, there are maybe some biological differences in that way, but their bodies can't produce another human being in the same way that a female body can. So rather than, I think the Quran in its statement was actually recognizing that there's difference, and there's like a difference of, certain preferences here, certain preferences here. A female body can like nurse, like that's just to stop and think about that. That's incredible. And the Quran doesn't overlook details like this, right? And so by putting in our own ideas that men are preferred over women, we've, stepped on something that is inherently very beautiful in the Quranic discourse, and, flattened it out to misogynistic biases. And so we have to be really aware that has been a tendency, and we have to continue to work to either make better translations available, or to, like ourselves, be able to keep working to learn the Arabic so that we can access the insights more directly and not through someone's preconceived notions.
That makes a lot of sense. So if I were reading a translation that is misogynistic, but I don't know that it's misogynistic, but I see something that I'm reading and I think that doesn't make sense, do I just automatically assume that it's biased, or is there like a way to find out? Or
yeah, I think the unfortunate thing is that the internet can both be a help but a tremendous harm too. So if you just put something in a search engine, who knows if you're going to come up with reliable results. And so having actual trusted teachers in life is incredibly important. And just like we wouldn't turn our kids over and just say, learn, maybe we turn them over to Khan Academy or something because we know it's a reliable source, but we have to, we have to know what are the reliable sources, and also, who are the reliable teachers as well. And there's teachers who, just to go on with this metaphor, can turn a child off from learning math, or can turn a child off from learning a foreign language. And then there's teachers who can, bring that language to life, or bring, math alive in a way. And we have to think about our own religious sciences like that. There's an art to teaching religious sciences. There's a way in which we have to make it engaging. And I actually think the Ismaili community does a really fantastic job of this. And I think Muslims more broadly can learn from your example in terms of, the teaching and learning.
Thank you so much. And I was just thinking that, a lot of us, when we hear the guidance of our imam, for example, we hear a lot about equality, but then sometimes people will go to read the Quran and find a translation that is more misogynistic, and the two things seem to contradict. So I think your advice is really helpful in weighing the ethos of the Quran versus translations versus our own intellect versus finding a teacher. So all of these components go into understanding this text. Okay, we have another question that actually relates to God's communication with women. So I think people are wondering, why are there not women prophets, or are they, or what is the nature of God's communication with women? Do women speak to God as messengers?
Mm-hmm. One of the beautiful things I realized in doing research from this book is that you go all the way through the Quran until you get to the surah of Yusuf, alayhi salam, and every single instance of a women's speech is actually a prayer to God, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so there's a tremendous sense that many of the women figures, in fact, I would say most of the women figures mentioned, have a robust relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. Their speech is this beautified speech reflecting prayers for their needs, prayers for instance, in the case of the mother of Mary, prayers dedicating the baby in her womb to the service of God. So the prayer life of women is something the Quran really highlights. And I think we can learn from that as kind of contemporary people, and that is kind of an essence of having that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is just going to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with our deepest needs and our desires, and dedicating our lives and our purpose, finding our life purpose in this relationship. There was a question that went through the chat about why are there not any women prophets explicitly named. This is a fascinating question, and what I point out in the book is, in fact, where I start the book, is that Maryam alayhi salam, she gives birth to Isa, who is called Kalimat Allah, which is like the word of God. And so we can think of prophets who are bringing new scriptures in the form of like the Rasul, the ones who bring scriptures. They're receiving from the angel, from Jibreel alayhi salam, they're receiving words that then they give to the people. Maryam alayhi salam is also conversing with this angel, receives this ruh, and in turn gives birth to the Kalimat Allah, to the word of God. And we can't help but notice these interesting parallels. And just as it's easy to overlook that, it's just a very subtle detail, but I think this gives us an insight into Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives inspiration to the heart of the mother of Musa, the mother of Moses, may peace be upon her. And the word that the Quran uses is the verb that means, to give revelation. Like we talk about the Quran is wahi, that's the Arabic word for revelation. And the Quran, gives revelation, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives revelation to the heart of the mother of Moses. And so I think if we're asking the question, why are there no women prophets explicitly mentioned, we're actually overlooking these subtle details that the Qur'an gives us to show the ways in which women are in fact in deep communication with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the angels, and are, in both of these cases, the women do incredibly difficult things that then make prophecy possible. So in some ways, I once asked a very esteemed sheikh this very question when I was like much younger, and he said to me at the time that all the prophets had mothers, didn't they? And to me, it wasn't a satisfying answer at the time. But now that I think deeper into what the Qur'an is showing us in terms of specifically Maryam and the mother of Musa, may peace be upon them both, I think there's something much more subtle happening. And to understand women in the Qur'an is to be attuned to the subtle. And so I think we just have to recommit ourselves to thinking in this way.
Thank you so much. And I think perhaps one of the last questions, it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about in terms of interpreting the Quran, but are there English translations of the Quran that you find more helpful in terms of accuracy?
Yes. So I personally, in my book, I turn to the study Quran because this is a project that was done as a collaboration of 5 different academics, all of whom have a very specialized knowledge of not just the Islamic sources, but have an incredible grasp of English as well. And though I differ in places with the study Quran and their, in different places, their selection of words, I propose different translations that I think are more accurate or more reflective of a particular ethos. That is the one translation in terms of issues of women and gender that seems to be a reliable source. And it's helpful because it's a translation that also includes extensive notes. Dr. Saeed Hussein Nasser was the one who spearheaded the project and drew the scholars together. And Maria Dakake, who is a professor who also specializes, she does a number of work on women in the Quran as well. And so she was consulted and actually did the commentary for a number of sections of this project. So in that way, it's unlike many other translations, it has kind of had the direct influence of someone who has experience in women and gender studies. The other, Leila Bakhtiar, may God be pleased with her, did a tremendous amount of work on translating the Quran as well. And I know a number of people really resonate with her scholarship too.
Thank you so much. And I think we have one more question. Are there any women not mentioned in the Quran, but of great significance for us as Muslims or people who believe in Abrahamic traditions that you would want to highlight for us?
Yeah, so I think we as Muslims have this tremendous history of like a sacred history of women that we share with other Abrahamic faiths. So we have some women who we share with the Jewish community, and then even more women who we share with the Jewish and Christian community. Excuse me. Then we have a whole, in terms of women we can look to, we have a whole set of women who are the contemporaries of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who may be mentioned in the Quran in general terms, but aren't mentioned in specific terms. So this is a whole other kind of group of women who we can look to, who are astounding in their bravery and in their kind of understanding of the ethos of Islam and in their teaching, etc. So there's this whole another grouping of women. And then we can look to our history beyond just the formative period and see many women, like the woman who had the idea to bring water more efficiently to the pilgrims in Mecca, and who designed the aqueducts. To this day, you can still see as you drive past the Hajj sites. Like, this is the ingenuity of a woman saying, we need to get water to the pilgrims. And so, you can trace this legacy from Hajar all the way to through our history. And so I think we have to learn it, we have to teach it, we have to make a point of bringing this legacy out, of highlighting it. And we need to keep our, in a society in which, like living in the West, in which there is this tremendous influence and emphasis on women's women's capacity, women's capability. Now is a great time to say, look at all of these women in our sacred history who, even before there was an official women's movement, who were, caring for the orphans and building orchards and schools, and, the oldest library / university in the world was built with the influence of a woman, Fahma Fihri, in North Africa. So it's a great time to just highlight the contributions that have already been there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I actually have a final question of my own, which is maybe you could speak a little bit about the concept of gender and God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're living in a predominantly, at least in the US and in other places in the world, a predominantly Christian society who has an explicitly, even though if you technically look, there'll be a non-gender description of God, but then God in paintings, God in the figure, astaghfirullah, of Jesus, and this likeness. So it's a very male God, right? And we, subhanAllah, we don't have that in Islam. We've always understood God as being beyond gender, and we have not had to reinterpret our definition of God to, as Muslims. It has been inherently not embodied in male form, and so alhamdulillah, although we use it can be confusing for people, perhaps because translations often use the pronoun he, which in English we use for male beings. We don't use it for is in a general sense, but people who study Arabic know that, as in French and as in Spanish, as in German, that pronouns are not indicators of a biological gender in any way. And so alhamdulillah, we have even the word like Rahman Rahim, the words merciful and compassionate, these are cognates. The womb itself is a cognate of that root. So there's these beautiful significances, reminders that we can't think about God in masculine terms at all, that's a not only is it wrong based on our aqidah, on our basic creed, but it's also not true to the self-description of God in the Qur'an and in other sacred sources.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about, but we are coming to the end of our time today. So I wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. Hopefully this is just the start of the conversation, and today was also a big privilege for me as well. So thank you. I wanted to say thank you to all of you. And I would really recommend that all of you take a look at Dr. Ibrahim's book. Many of the questions that are coming through that we may not have gotten to are addressed there. And there's a much more nuanced explanation, especially if you're interested in some of the grammatical aspects of the pronouns that we were just talking about. A couple of announcements before we all go. So in the chat box, we are pasting some additional resources that have been shared by Dr. Ibrahim. So some of them are links to her books and her articles. There's also the profile of Dr. Shanila Kojamulji, who also has a lot of scholarship on women and gender. So if any of you are interested, please check out those websites in order to have some more information. The recording of this conversation and past conversations will be posted on the Ismaili USA website, the Facets of Faith page, and that has been posted in the chat box as well. Please look out for more information on the Ismaili USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week, as well as our next critical conversation. And if I could request all of you to please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up when you leave the webinar, would really appreciate all of your feedback. And if you have further questions, you could probably leave them there. Thank you so much, everybody. And yeah, Ali Madad.